Okay. My name is Nicolas Maslowski, for those who don't know me, and I am working at the Faculty of Political Sciences and International Relations, University of Warsaw, and we have a new guest in for our cycle, Geopolitical Tuesdays. Today we have a high-level guest, Professor Olivier Schmidt. I'm very happy and very proud to have you here, dear Professor, dear Olivier, and to speak about a very historical and very actual topic, very important for international relations, but very interdisciplinary as well. This is the topic of the diffusion of military power in the 21st century. Maybe I am wrong, but the way I understand it is how to analyze the complexity of the world, the distribution of the power, the situation in international relations, and how to build concepts, words that would be understood by specialists of political sciences, international relations, but as well sociologists and historians and other specialists of social sciences. Thank you so much for accepting to speak with us, to us here in Warsaw, and thank you that you are offering such an attractive and actual topic. The floor is yours. I just remind you that we will be happy if we have time at the end to leave some time for question and answers. We have a lot of students among us. We have as well some colleagues from the University of Warsaw or from other places. We are always happy when we have questions. It is not always the case, but often. and for the people in the public, I remind you as well that at the end there will be the possibility to raise directly question to Professor Olivier Schmidt, but you can as well write those questions during the talk, during the presentation in the chat. And when Professor Olivier Schmidt will have the feeling that it's a good moment to answer, he will answer. It can be at the end, yes, with the other questions, or it could be, if necessary, during the speech here. He has a total freedom of expression. So, Professor Olivier Schmidt, you are working at the Center for War Studies, University of Southern Denmark, and you are dealing with contemporary strategic issues as geoeconomics and economic security. You are author of Allies That Count, Junior Partners in Coalition Warfare. You are associate editor of European Journal of International Security. And I have the feeling that you have just a new book that appeared in France. Yes, maybe you will tell us a few words about how to prepare a war, or I don't know how to translate this, the title of this book. I ordered it already, but I had no time to read it. And now the floor is yours. I suppose that you are speaking from Denmark. So feel free now to take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I'm quite happy to, although being physically in Denmark, to be addressing you now in Warsaw and wherever you are listening to this conference. And indeed, I'm going to talk and present on a paper I am working on at the moment, which is trying to provide a conceptual framework on how to think about what I call military diffusion. And what I suggest we can do is that I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and that should leave plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. So without any further ado, I am going to share my screen. Okay, I need to allow the sharing. Okay, so I need to quit Zoom and reopen it in order to be allowed to share my screen. So I will disconnect very quickly, and don't worry, I will reconnect back almost immediately. Yeah, it's those update things that needs to be done, and it decided to update right now. So there you go.
And I use this moment when we don't have our guests anymore with us to remind what Kinga wrote already in the chat, that for the students participating here to our meeting and to this series of conferences, you have an essay to submit, and you have to submit it in 2 weeks. Yes, 2 weeks, it's not so much, but you can send those essays to us earlier. And I wanted to say hello to my colleagues here, Kinga, Torbitka, and Tomasz Łukaszuk.
Okay, in principle, it should be working.
It works.
Okay, perfect. So you can see my screen. Perfect. So without any further ado, I'm just going to go straight for it. And with the first question on why should we care about the topic of military diffusion? And the first one is that diffusion is not innovation. There is always a bit of let's call it a bit of a focus in the literature in international relations and security studies on military innovation per se, because there is this baked-in assumption that innovation provides an edge on the battlefield if you are the first one to use a new military technology, develop a new military technology, or develop a new way of war, a new way to use military power, you will get an advantage. Therefore, a lot of the literature is actually focused on innovation in itself. But most states in the international system, most powers, most countries cannot afford to always innovate. And what they do most of the time is that they are, second order or third order adopters of new military technologies, which means that the technology is diffusing in the international system. And those phenomena, they tend to be overlooked when we only look at innovation. We tend to overlook the second order and third order effects of how military power is diffusing. And in itself, those phenomena of diffusion are also extremely important. Why? Because this diffusion helps us understand the distribution of military power. The patterns and the mechanisms through which diffusion occur help us understand which countries, which bloc or group of countries are more likely to obtain a military advantage. And if they do obtain a military advantage, that can be translated into overall political power within the international system itself. So understanding diffusion is at least as important as understanding innovation, because diffusion is really what helps us understand what the balance of military power will look like. The third reason why diffusion is important is that it helps us understand or qualify or analyze the way military partnerships and alliance networks in the international system actually operate. A good example would be to look at two situations. For example, a situation in which there is no formal military alliance between two countries, such as the US and Israel. There are no formal military treaty forming an alliance between the two countries. But of course, there has been a lot of military diffusion from the US to Israel. And although legally speaking, there is no treaty binding them together, looking at the patterns of military diffusion help us qualify the depth and the intensity of the relationship between the two countries. On the opposite side, we can look at cases in which there is a formal treaty between states, such as between the United States and Turkey within the framework of NATO. But the patterns of military diffusion help us assess the extent to which there is a quality political relationship between the two countries. And the fact that the United States decided to block for some time the exports of the F-35 jet fighter to Turkey in retaliation for Turkey purchasing a number of Russian weapon systems, that looking at those patterns of military diffusion, they help us qualify, again, the quality of the political relationship. So looking at patterns of military diffusion are a kind of extra information that we get about political dynamics and partnerships in the international system. Fourth reason is that if we look at military diffusion, we can have a better sense of the risks of arms race in the international system itself. Arms race are a phenomenon that is usually well conceptualized. We have different theoretical explanations for why arms races occur. But looking at military diffusion can help us better explain how they occur. What are the patterns? What are the networks? What are the channels through which military power is diffused? And that helps us answer an important question in international security, which is arms races. And finally, if we look at how diffusion occurs, we can also think about how to regulate it. If we have a better understanding of military diffusion patterns, we can potentially be better at devising arms control agreements that will limit, that will regulate, that will control the way military power is diffusing. If we understand the mechanism and the reasons better, we can also probably understand ways to counter it more efficiently, so to speak. So overall, military diffusion kind of underpins a lot of international security issues, and it's a bit of an unspoken or not fully fledged development and concept that is sort of taken for granted, but it is which is also somehow under-conceptualized and that we need to think seriously about. So those are the reasons why we should care about military diffusion if we are interested in international security issues. And there is a number of problems with the existing literature. The first problem is that we have a number of disciplinary silos between historians, political scientists, and military sociologists. And usually what happens is that people are going to talk about the same thing using different terms, or they are going to use the same term to describe different things. And that comes because of different traditions, different intellectual traditions, different literatures. People don't necessarily read each other. And there is therefore a conceptual murkiness that is now existing in the field of security studies because of those disciplinary silos. Another problem, I think, with the term itself is that we also have intellectual silos depending on what kind of weapon systems people are looking at. And I put the example of proliferation studies, which is a term very strongly associated with nuclear weapons. You know, the literature on nuclear weapons and nuclear security has been looking a lot at proliferation and counter-proliferation. But proliferation fundamentally is diffusion. It's the exact same thing. But people looking at conventional weapon systems, we talk about diffusion without necessarily talk about proliferation because the term is so strongly associated with nuclear weapons. And therefore, it prevents building on each other, building on insights, building on a common understanding of mechanisms, and so on and so forth. A third issue that we have is that we do have competing theories in order to explain military diffusion. The first one is the adoption capacity theory by Michael Horowitz, in which he basically argues that diffusion will happen depending on how capable states are to actually adopt a specific military technology. Just to give an example, aircraft carriers are extremely intensive and costly to adopt for an organization because, well, first, they are so expensive, and they also require to completely rethink the structure of a navy. Because when you have an aircraft carrier, you, of course, also need to have aircraft on the aircraft carriers. Sounds obvious, but there is also the need to rethink the way you are going to train your sailors, what kind of promotion patterns and career tracks you are going to offer to them. And you also need to rethink your force structure because the aircraft carrier does not operate alone. You also need submarines to protect it. You also need frigates to protect it. So when you purchase an aircraft carrier, you actually purchase an entire way of going to war, which is very expensive, and not all states can do it. This is why you only have very few states who can actually develop aircraft carriers. On the opposite, a machine gun, such as, I don't know, Kalashnikov or an M16 or whatever, that is not very costly, right? It's relatively cheap, and it can be used very easily by the armed forces. Therefore, it is much more likely to diffuse because it's not much of a cost for the organization to adopt it. So that's one theory. Diffusion is based on how much military organizations can actually accept and what costs it has for the organization. A second competing theory is what I call the strategic emulation. And it's mostly associated with people like Barry Posen. So like the most, realists within the US security studies community. And it is a very, again, strategic, rational way of understanding emulation, basically saying states look at what works and they try to copy it. And there are states who succeed in copying what works in warfare, and states who just don't succeed. And those who succeed, well, they become more powerful than those who don't succeed. So it's a very rational, strategic way of looking at diffusion. And diffusion is basically states looking at each other and trying to identify what works in war and trying to copy it. And there is a third type of explanation associated with the constructivists, for example, people like Theo Farrell, and basically saying that states are not only rational, but military power also come associated with baked-in specific assumptions and specific norms of what is supposed to be working. And states will want to adopt technologies or practices or way of doing stuff based on the status that it provides them with. And a good example is the Irish armed forces in the 1920s, 1930s. The Irish armed forces had correctly identified that England was probably the most challenging threat to them. And, there was always a risk of an English invasion of Ireland, and therefore Ireland should be preparing for, a war against England. But at the same time, the UK was very much a strongly dominating military power compared to Ireland. So in terms of conventional conflict, the Irish armed forces will not have stood a chance against the British armed forces. So rationally, strategically speaking, it did not make sense to adopt a conventional fighting strategy against the British because the Irish would have been rolled over. The rational strategic choice would have been to actually adopt, kind of a guerrilla type of strategy, guerrilla small wars type of strategy in order to counter the British advantage in conventional warfare. And especially because the Irish actually had expertise in that kind of warfare, because they were just coming out of the Irish Civil War, in which they had developed those tactics and those approach to operations. So guerrilla, irregular warfare, small wars, this kind of stuff. And it's not what they did. They went for the classic conventional way of preparing for war. Why? Because at the time, the gold standard of what military forces should look like was the British armed forces. And there was this sense that in order to be taken seriously as a military organization, the Irish armed forces should try to copy the gold standard, which was the British, and therefore they adopted a very similar organization, even though strategically speaking, it did not make sense. Why? Because the great powers in the international system sort of set a standard of what a real military should look like. And those norms of what it should look like diffuse, and other states try to emulate them. Right now, within NATO, there is, of course, a kind of emulation going on with the United States, because the United States tend to set the standards of, what the gold standard in terms of military professionalism is, and other NATO countries tend to imitate the way the United States does things, because it's a way to signal we are doing like the great power, therefore it must be effective, even though strategically speaking, it's not necessarily always the case. So we have the three competing theories, and the problem is that, in my understanding, they are more complementary than competing alternative explanations. And what I wanted to do with this paper was also trying to find a way to integrate those different explanations for diffusion in a more cohesive conceptual framework. So what I'm developing is not much a theory of military diffusion, but a concept and a way to think about it, and hoping that this conceptual framework will then help people theorize about other things afterwards. But I wanted to go back first to concept development before going on to a further new theory of diffusion itself. All right, so let's go with, how do I define military diffusion? I define it as the sequential adoption, partial or complete, and by one or more states, of a military technology, doctrine, and or practice. And here, every single element of the definition is important. It's sequential. So you have a first mover, and you have a second mover, and a third mover, and so on. So it occurs through time. It takes time to diffuse. It is partial or complete. So you can adopt parts of a military innovation, or you can completely adopt it. And again, it's a way to think about it. So it's important to differentiate between partial and complete adoption. By one or more states, so diffusion starts at 2 states. I mean, that's very basic, and it can be much more than that. And final part of the definition, it's a military technology, doctrine, and or practice. And I wanted to broaden the scope of what is being looked at, because there is in the literature a tendency to look at the diffusion of military technologies and sometimes of doctrines, but it's a very technology-focused literature. Why? Because technologies are observable. They are like easier to observe. If a jet fighter is being adopted, if an aircraft carrier is being adopted, it is easier to look at. And I wanted to expand the scope of what we are looking at when we are looking at military diffusion, because military power is not only about technology, it's about how you say you are going to use that technology, and that is doctrine. And it is also about how you actually use the technology, and it is the practices. And I wanted to take all this into account. The second characteristic is that you need to look at the scope, the range, and the speed of diffusion. The scope is whether you adopt a diffusion partially or complete, whether you adopt a military technology doctrine and or practice partially or completely. To give you an example, the Leopard 2 tanks that Germany produced, and which is now in use in a lot of NATO countries, including Spain, including Denmark, including Poland, if I'm not mistaken, actually. Those are not the same tanks everywhere you are. The framework is still the same, the core structure is still the same, but every single country has its own tweak to it and its own specific little additions to it. So the scope is relatively large because it's the Leopard 2 tanks, but it's actually a lot of different Leopard 2 tanks. Second thing we need to look at is the range of diffusion, and it is the number of countries that are going to adopt those military technology doctrine and practice. If it's a small range, only a few countries adopt those MTDPs, so military technology doctrine and practice. I will use the term MTDP because it's faster. And if it's a lot of countries who adopt the MTDP, the range is quite wide. And of course, finally, we need to look at the speed of diffusion, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Speed is how fast the MTDP is diffusing in the international system. And in theory, in principle, looking at the three criteria, we should be able to eventually, with the appropriate indicators, we could be able to visually represent diffusion in the graph that I laid out on the right side of the slide. So comparing speed, range, and scope of diffusion. So eventually, my ambition is that we could be able to develop relevant indicators that will help us quantify what right now are mostly qualitative and conceptual frames to think about diffusion, but that will come probably later. All right, so how do we explain military diffusion? Because that's what's important. And I understand diffusion as being the combination of 4 different reasons, and the interactions between those 4 different reasons help explain the likelihood of diffusion or not. So let's look at motivation, mechanisms, characteristics, and organizational culture. The first is motivation, and we need to think about it as a spectrum going from status-motivated states to threat-motivated states. Status is, you adopt something because it looks good, right? And you want to be a part of the club of the countries who own a specific MTDP. And it does happen, right? It's there is sometimes a phenomenon of conspicuous consumption, so to speak, in military technologies, countries adopting a technology because it looks good and because they want to be part of a club. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is if you're motivated by a specific threat, and if you're motivated by a threat, you are more likely to adopt a specific MTDP, which you think will help you counter that threat. If you're motivated by status, diffusion is slower because the incentives are, in my view, less intense. The second thing to think about are the mechanisms through which the diffusion occurs. If it occurs through a voluntary transfer, so for example, arms sales, I am the United States, I am selling a weapon system to Saudi Arabia. Well, diffusion is pretty obvious, right? Because it's a voluntary transfer from one state to the other. Therefore, diffusion is more likely if you have official approved transfer mechanisms like that. Another transfer mechanism can be within NATO, for example, right? NATO as an alliance is a good way to facilitate the transfer of MTDPs because NATO member states interact with each other all the time in official settings. On the other end of the spectrum, something that make it less likely to be diffused is what I call emulation, which is an involuntary diffusion. Basically, it's spying. It is when a country tries to copy what another country is doing, either by trying to get open source information or by spying on it to try to copy it. But of course, it is harder to do, right? It's more difficult to imitate someone by yourself instead of that person directly giving you something. So voluntary transfer make diffusion more likely, emulation makes it less likely. Third, there are the characteristics of the MTDP itself. Is it easy to implement or is it hard to implement? I think this one is straightforward. If an MTDP is easy to implement as it does not require military organizations to change a lot, well, it will diffuse. If it's hard to implement, it will be harder to diffuse. And that's basically what I was talking about earlier about Michael Horowitz's adoption capacity theory. And finally, there is a fourth factor to take into account, which is the organizational culture of the armed forces themselves. If the armed forces have a relatively flexible culture, a doctrine which can be easily adapted, an officer corps which has the intellectual bandwidth to change the way they do things, an MTDP is more likely to diffuse. If the armed forces are very rigid in terms of their organizational culture, basically they don't want to change what they do because, and we can talk about it in the Q&A afterwards, but because the armed forces are organizations which are very based on cohesion, so they need cohesion to be military effective, and anything that challenges that cohesion can be seen as a threat, and that can make the organizations quite rigid. If the armed forces are quite rigid, of course, the diffusion is less likely to happen. So we can summarize those mechanisms or insights, so to speak, in that table with the likelihood of diffusion going on a spectrum from low to high, and the factors that make the likelihood lower on the left. So if you are motivated by status, if you are trying to emulate or copy something, if the MTDP is hard to implement, and if your organizational characteristics are rigid, well, an MTDP is unlikely to diffuse. But on the other hand, if countries are motivated by threats, if there are mechanisms for voluntary transfers, if it is easy to implement, and if the receiving organization is flexible, the MTDP is much more likely to diffuse. And this needs to be thought of as a spectrum, right? In real life, you will see a lot of interactions on those four factors. Empirically, it's always, it's always going to be a mix of where the cursor is on those gradients, so to speak. But conceptually, this is how we can classify the factors favoring diffusion or hindering diffusion. And right now, I would like to illustrate this with 3 examples of potential MTDPs that could diffuse in the international system within the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to start with something which is called multi-domain operations. Multi-domain operations is a military doctrine, and it's a way to think about how to integrate military assets in order to maximize their common effects. So it seems somehow, I mean, for people who are not really interested in military operations, if I tell you that ideally, you should combine your naval capabilities and your land capabilities and your air capabilities and your cyber capabilities in order to maximize effect, people are usually like, yes, that makes sense. That's pretty obvious. In practice, it is really, really hard to do because it's baked in the way we analyze and assess responsibilities to what happens on the battlefield. Basically, if you are a captain commanding a platoon of tanks, you command your tanks, but you have very low visibility on what's happening in the air and what's happening at sea. By definition, you cannot know that because it will be too much to process. And all the information you receive are within the land chain of command, and you send back up information also in the land chain of command. Same for the jet fighter pilot, same from for the sailor in a ship. They are all in their own chain of command for the land, for the sea, and for the air environment. And all those information, they are usually synthesized within the headquarters for the operation, which means that the headquarters has the job of trying to reconcile all those informations in something that is actionable, and to then bring down the information to the tanks, to the jet fighter, and to the ship, basically saying, you need to be there at that time and do this, and trust us because we know what we're doing, because we have also given orders to the planes to protect you and the ships to fire artillery also to protect you. So it's a mechanism of going up, centralize, and then down again to the battlefield. And that takes time, right? That does not happen immediately because you always need to synthesize all those informations. The idea behind military multi-domain operations is that because of new technologies and digital technologies, it is much faster to integrate the information that the tank, the jet fighter, and the ship are sending up, because the technology allows us to immediately send those information. And they can be synthesized in basically one big operational picture, almost live. And the idea is that if we can do that, technologically speaking, we will be able to much better allocate targets and much better allocate objectives to the different assets. So instead of saying the tanks are going to go in that direction and do this, we can think about, I want that target to be destroyed. Which is the best place to do it? Is it the ship? Is it the tank? Or is it the plane? So it reverses the logic. Instead of starting from a logic of what can my assets do and then tell them to do something, we start from what do I want as an effect, and I can use any of the assets I have to allocate the target. So it's the integration of technology allows to shift the mindset through which we plan military operations. And it is a revolution, right? Because for several thousand years, military operation, well, so 100 years at least, military operations were based on the logic that I was describing earlier, that what can my tanks do, what can my infantry do, and then I find something for them to do. Instead, it's shifting the logic to the effect I want to achieve. So what does that mean in terms of diffusion potential? It is a doctrine which is initially being developed by the United States because of the technology to do it. And it means that in terms of range of diffusion, it will be moderately wide. For a simple reason is that the United States are diffusing this doctrine to all their allies. NATO has already officially adopted multi-domain operations doctrine, and so is Japan, so is South Korea, so basically US allies. So through the mechanisms of US alliances, the doctrine is diffusing, but it is unlikely to completely diffuse in its current form outside of the US alliances. So that's for the range. In terms of scope, the scope is relatively large because those multi-domain operations, they can be, I mean, I can get into details afterward if you want, but they can basically be at a very tactical level, or they can go up to a very strategic level of not only integrating military assets, but only thinking about how to integrate diplomatic, legal, and economic tools of power into a big campaign plan. So the scope is very large because some countries will only be interested in the very military technical aspect to it, and some countries will only be interested in all of it. From the tactical to the operational, to the strategic, to the political level of MDOs. And the speed is likely to be relatively fast, again, because we have the transfer mechanisms in place to do it. And there is also an incentive to adopt it, because if it works, it promises to provide a strong military advantage. So countries will have an incentive to adopt it because they can react to threats in a much more efficient way. So there will be an incentive to adopt it, and therefore it's likely to be relatively quickly adopted. And basically, the US started developing their doctrine in 2014, and NATO officially adopted an MDO doctrine 8 years later, which is relatively fast. So the diffusion likelihood of MDOs as a doctrine is relatively high. A second example is something called collective command. Collective command is a practice. It is a way to exercise command in headquarters nowadays. And it's mostly associated with the work of British military sociologist Anthony King. We can debate whether he is correctly identifying something or not, but I'm just using its description of command to think about how it could diffuse. And so the idea of collective command is that the general who used to be at the top of a chain of command, so basically information going up and down, and him giving orders to his staff, is now at the center of a network. And that's why it's becoming a collective command, because sociologically speaking, being at the center of the network, the decision is not the general alone to make, but it becomes a collective practice of decision-making. And that's the arguments that Anthony King is developing. So now let's think about it in a way. It is very associated with Western military practice. This is what King is saying, is that we only see that right now in Western military organizations. The second thing is that its effectiveness is debatable, in the sense that Western military organizations did not really have an important track record of military success over the past 20 years, with defeats in Iraq, Afghanistan, in the Sahel for the French, and so on. So it might not be extremely appealing in a way, right? And it's not something you teach, it's something you do. So you don't really have formal diffusion mechanisms the way they exist in an alliance, for example. So what does that tell us in terms of diffusion likelihood and potential? So the range of diffusion is likely to be narrow because not many countries will have an incentive to adopt it. First, it's unproven as a practice. Second, it's as I was mentioning, you cannot reteach it, so you don't have a lot of you don't have official transfer mechanisms from it. It can only occur when people see it happening and maybe thinking about it. So it's a limited opportunity for diffusion, and also it has a cost for military organizations because it changes symbolically the role of the general. You know, symbolically speaking, generals are on top of the chain, right? If you tell them they're not going to be on top of the chain anymore, they don't like it. So again, it's not a strong incentive for military organizations to adopt that practice. It means that the range of diffusion is likely to be narrow. The scope of diffusion is also likely to be small because it's not something you can partially adopt. Either you do collective command or you don't. So it's not like you can have something in between, right? So the scope of diffusion is likely to be small. And finally, because we don't have a lot of formal transfer mechanisms in place, the speed of diffusion is likely to be slow as well. And therefore, I assess the likelihood of diffusion as being low overall for collective command. And finally, the last example to illustrate the value of the framework is to think about military artificial intelligence. And that's a technology, right? So I've presented a doctrine, a practice, and a technology. Military AI, of course, promises to give a lot of advantages to military organizations, and military AI can be a lot of different things. It can help with targeting, it can help with logistics, it can help with coordinating military assets such as and help develop robots. It can help with planning and conducting operations by suggesting a course of actions. It can help with targeting by providing commanders with options on what to do and how to use their ammunitions. So military AI is not one technology, it's a lot of different potential applications. The second thing is that it is it's sexy, right? States want to do it because you all know the famous sentence by Vladimir Putin: whoever is going to control AI is going to rule the world, blah blah blah. But there is a status element to it, right? There is a prestige element associated with saying we are doing stuff with artificial intelligence at the moment. So not only there is a threat or security incentive to it, but there is also a strong status incentive associated with it. Third, it is quite likely to diffuse because we have a lot of diffusion networks in the sense that artificial intelligence is primarily developed by public and civilian companies. Therefore, those civilian companies, they have a strong incentive to diffuse as much as they can, and turning into a civilian AI system into a military AI system is actually really, really easy. And fourth, AI does not change fundamentally how the armed forces are working. So it's likely that there will be not a lot of resistance to technological adoption. So overall, when we think about it, the range of diffusion is likely to be very wide because a lot of countries will want to use some form of military artificial intelligence. Again, the scope is going to be very large because, as I was mentioning, military AI can be a lot of different things. And some countries will want to do as much AI as they can. Some countries will limit it to specific functions, but the scope will be very large. And the speed of diffusion is likely to be very fast because, again, the channels of diffusion are very hard to regulate because those channels are primarily civilians, and therefore civilian private companies have an incentive to diffuse because, you know, that's profit. So the diffusion likelihood of military artificial intelligence overall is very high. And that I will just stop here. Those were all illustrations of how to think about the military diffusion. But of course, the ambition is that this framework can be applied to a lot of different cases. And I just used those 3 cases as, let's say, proof of concepts for the heuristic utility of the framework. So thanks for this, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. So now is the moment when I'm asking if someone has a question or a comment, please raise your hand physically, or yes, Mr. Paweł Jastrzębski.
I have a question. What does it mean, the scope of the diffusion in more deep way? Because I'm not sure whether I understand the concept.
So what I mean by scope is that an MTDP can be adopted partially or completely. And that's what I was talking about with military artificial intelligence, for example. Military AI can be a lot of different things. So some countries will only adopt a narrow scope of military AI, basically limiting it to 1 or 2 specific functions. And some countries will want to have a very wide scope of military AI applications. And this is what I mean by scope, right? Is that you can adopt an MTDP partially or completely, and there are degrees of partiality in terms of what parts of the MTDP you are adopting or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a useful explanation. Maybe, is there another question? So until the moment you find the courage to ask your question or inspiration, maybe I will find time for my question. I was never thinking so much about this diffusion, so for me it's something new, and I think it's very motivating. My question is: now we are full of this actuality of this war in Ukraine, the kind of war in Gaza, and we have the feeling that there is more wars than usually. Are this kind of moments of acceleration, of diffusion, or rather, I would say, a kind of game changer in the diffusion model? Yeah, we have the intuition that it is a moment where the observation of the practices and the efficiency is quite open.
So no, they do. I mean, wars are accelerators in a way of diffusion, mostly because everybody is looking at them in order to try to understand what MTDPs they should look for their own force structure models. But that happens for every single war. You always have like external observers trying to derive lessons. This being said, it's not always easy because there is a problem of access to data. We think we see a lot of the war in Ukraine or of the war in Gaza, but what we see is actually mediated by, you know, people taking cell phone videos and so on, and it's hard to know how representative they are of the actual battlefield, right? So if countries don't have observers on the ground, it's hard to get a really good picture of the operational environment. The second thing is that even with observers on the ground, they may completely misread and misinterpret what is happening. One of my favorite examples is the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905. And there was a lot of military observers, Western military observers in Russia and Japan in 1904-1905. And looking at the war, there is a lot of patterns that we see that will also happen in World War I. It's the first war where machine guns are heavily used, where we have trenches, where we have barbed wire to prevent movements, where artillery is so important. So in a way, when you look at it with the benefit of insight, clearly that war announces a lot of things that will be rediscovered in 1914, 1915, 10 years later. But when you look at the reports by military observers from France, from the UK, from Germany, and so on, they all end up basically saying, oh, it will not happen to us because our doctrine is better and because the Japanese don't fight the way we fight, and the Russians were bad at what they were doing, and we will be better. So there are always, this kind of cultural, cognitive filters to interpretation. And I mean, to be honest, at the time also baked in racism towards the Japanese and the Russians, were basically saying, oh, but we will fight differently because we are Westerners, right? And there are always those filters to, it will not happen to us. So observing foreign wars always happens, but it's very hard to derive meaningful lessons from it.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there any other questions? So maybe I would have some more questions, but before I will ask my second question, just to achieve my first question, do you have any intuition on what kind of practice or doctrine could be diffused from this actual wars? Do you have a...
Yeah.
I know it's too early, but...
That's $1 million question, right? I think there are a number of things that we're probably going to see. The first one is how the use of drones is now completely widespread and is absolutely going to factor in any future conflict, either because states are going to use them or because we are going to develop countermeasures to those drones, right? Because it should never be thought about as being something static. If someone is doing something, people are going to work on the countermeasures. So we should think about the diffusion of what both the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing in terms of how they use drones, but also how probably countermeasures are going to emerge and going to be developed. And looking at Gaza, one thing which seems to be quite striking is the way the Israelis are using artificial intelligence to facilitate targeting and identify potential targets. And whatever we say, I think it's what a lot of countries are going to do in the future anyways, because it speeds up so much the decision-making cycle that the benefits in terms of potential military advantage outweighs the costs in terms of loss of meaningful human control on the targeting process. And it creates problems. I mean, we know it creates problems in terms of identifying people who should not have been identified. But I'm not saying that I'm ethically supporting it, but I think that most military organizations will find that the trade-off is acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here I see that Stanisław Krasiński is writing or wrote a question in the chat. Mr. Krasiński, do you want to ask directly the question, or would you prefer us to read it? So, if there is no possibility here to ask directly the question, but we can read the question. Would you say that there's a direct correlation between power and diffusion capability? For example, is it easier or harder for a more corrupt or poor country to adopt MTDPS?
Yeah, not a single vowel. But I will say it's more correlation between power and adoption capability, in the sense that, yes, countries that are richer and that have flexible organizations are much more likely to adopt an MTDP. The second thing that, because there is also a different way to understand the question, is to what extent can the adoption of capability be correlated with a rise in military power? And my answer is that it's really hard to know, because we think we know. I mean, before a war, we think we know what military power is and what kind of indicators we should look at, but we're always surprised. History is filled with countries which were thought to be, military important and competent and efficient and so on, and that are actually defeated relatively quickly. So we have a poor predictive capability of what will work in an actual war. But what we can think about is what countries think will work. And here we can see a correlation between countries adopting what they think will work and their capability to absorb it, whether financially, organizationally, or in terms of even cultural fit between technology and an organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question and for this answer. Any other questions? Please just raise your hand virtually or in front of your camera. I would have another naive question. I'm using these moments where there is no questions. You were speaking about proliferation as being a particular case for diffusion, and this was the inspiration for my question. Can you make any correlation between diffusion and polarity? Do you think that when you have a limited number of great powers, they may be able to content some diffusion, to limit some diffusion, but it is not anymore the case when you have a multipolar or complicated system?
Yeah, I think the main intervening factor is not that much the polarization of the system, so the number of great powers, but mostly the way military technology is being developed. And it has to do with the difference between closed innovation and open innovation. And I think that during the Cold War, we were in an era of closed innovation. Basically, military technologies were developed behind closed doors by people who had security clearances, and therefore were able to restrict the diffusion of those technologies to those they wanted to have access, right? If you are developing a new radar system for your jet fighters, you were able to actually restrict the number of countries who could access your radar system. Nowadays, most military innovations actually come from the civilian side. Think about artificial intelligence, think about softwares, think about geolocation, think about satellites, think about cyber. All this mostly come from the civilian side. So it's an era of open innovation, a bit like at the end of the 19th century, actually. And this is really, really hard to restrict. So it's not that much a matter of polarization or polarity of the system, but I will say mostly a matter of who gets to shape military innovation. And right now, I think it's mostly civilian industries that are developing technologies that are becoming militarized afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think intuitively it's very convincing, but I had to ask this question, and it can be a question as well for artificial intelligence if one day it is more under control. So, is there any other questions? Please raise your hand. If not, I still have a third question. I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize here your attention, but I'm using this moment. And once again, it's a naive question. But when we were seeing I'm more inspired by actualities, and when we were seeing what was called the hybrid war, that was a kind of development, maybe of a new tactics, or I don't know, even if not a kind of doctrine. I have the feeling that some powers are not ready to accept, for identity or ethical reasons, this kind of transformation. So my question concerns the relation between identity and here strategy or doctrine. Maybe you can yourself precise if you see that as a doctrine, strategy, or tactic.
Yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of the term hybrid because it has become associated with a lot of different things, and it's really hard to very clearly. Yeah, sorry, I've my 2 years old in the background, but it's so it has become relatively hard to really understand what people mean when they use the term hybrid, and usually they use the term hybrid to say stuff we don't like, like things which is done to us and which we don't like. So it's not a particularly useful framing. But to answer the broader question, yes, there is a normative dimension to diffusion and adoption of an MTDP. Basically, not all countries will do the same thing, because there is always a kind of normative component to whether we accept, for example, to breach international law or not. What is the degree of hostility that we are ready to admit in interactions? And it's a debate, for example, about if we are talking very concretely in terms of relationship with Russia. It's an ongoing debate right now in terms of should we, as Western countries, conduct hostile offensive operations against Russia, right? Because it has been a kind of a threshold that most Western countries were not willing to cross for normative ethical reasons. And basically saying, like, if we do the same thing as them, are we becoming like them? And I think it's a very fair debate to have, right? But to answer the broader question, yes, there are cases where countries, for normative, let's call them cultural reasons, are not willing to adopt a specific MTDP. So it's not only about capabilities, right?
Yes. Yes. So, do we have someone else motivated to ask a question? It's a unique possibility. Anna Sirbu. Anna, please.
Hello. I just want to ask you further on why the term hybrid war is bad, and what would you call the war between Russia and Ukraine then?
Yeah. The war between Russia and Ukraine is a war. I mean, it's kinetic, it's ongoing, and it's using different means, whether physical or non-physical, to achieve coercion and to compel an adversary. So I would call it a war. The problem with hybrid war is that it had different meanings over time. It started as developed by Frank Hoffman and Jim Mattis originally in the 2000s as a way to oh, sorry, I see that my computer is running out of battery. I will just go and find my plug, and I'll be back in 30 seconds. But I know where I stopped my explanation, so I'll be back immediately. Sorry.
Okay. And during that time, I discover that we have a new question. So it's a good moment to think about a new question.
Okay, power is flowing back into the computer now. So yeah, so originally it was developed as a way to think about the interaction between non-state actor and military capabilities, and specifically looking at Hezbollah, saying we now have a non-state actor which has almost the same military capabilities as a state. And that's a new thing. And it's a problem, so we need to think about tactics or approach differently. And the hybrid was between the non-state nature of the group, but the state-like nature of the military capabilities that they had. That's what hybrid was supposed to mean originally. Then there was the Russia first annexation of parts of Ukraine in 2014, and all the discussions about, the little green man, cyber campaigns, the fact that special forces and the Spetsnaz were heavily involved in Crimea and seizing military assets in Crimea and so on. And that's where I will say the new term hybrid came from, at least in NATO speak. But I'm not revealing any big state secret, but we organized a workshop in my university in 2016, and what someone from the NATO military command coming in talking about hybrid warfare, and he was basically saying, well, when we looked at the Russian campaign, what they did was propaganda. That's not really new. They used special forces. That's not really new either. And they managed to time their operation in order to confuse Western leaders. That's not super new either. But the term hybrid warfare was around, so we used it. And it had become this cottage industry within NATO countries to think about hybrid warfare, to talk about anything from cyber operations to subversion to special forces to propaganda, basically anything we don't like, a bit the way irregular warfare was a term in the 2000s to describe anything we did not like during our military campaigns. And it was further complicated by the fact that the Russians themselves started adopting the term hybrid warfare, but to describe what they think Western countries were doing to them. So when we were talking about hybrid warfare, and writing about hybrid warfare as what Russia is doing to us, they were using the term hybrid warfare, and there was a Russian term for it, as what they think the West is doing to them. And that has further complicated the understanding of the term itself. And my problem with it right now is that it is used in such a diversity of contexts that it's hard to know whether it's tactic or a specific mean of using force. Is it about cyber? Is it about subversion? Is it a combination of both? Well, what is it exactly? It's hard to know whether it's an operational design, so a specific way to think about a sequence of military activities. And I think it confuses the debates more than it helps analyzing what the Russians are doing and how we could counter it. So basically, it casts too wide a net to be analytically helpful. That's how we'll put it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you as well. I received two questions. One is on the chat. One I received personally because of a technological problem. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, recently stated in Foreign Affairs that regarding innovation, power technology will define the future of geopolitics. Technology is based on scientific knowledge and two, on availability of materials and metals. Do you see any link or intersection between the diffusion of military power in this technological century and the competition or collaboration for access for critical resources for technological advancement in both military and civilian domains? Thank you very much.
Yeah, as I was mentioning, I think the key point is that we are now in an era of open innovation, in which the key drivers of military change are actually coming from the civilian sector. And in that sense, we need to think hard about what we used to consider, a defense technological and industrial base, like this DTIB, which is a very Cold War term, right? Which is very associated with how are we going to build our ships, our planes, and so on. I think the definition of what constitutes a defense technological and industrial basis should be expanded or rethought, because a lot of weapon systems now actually run on softwares, and those softwares, they are primarily derived from civilian expertise. So this distinction that used to be a really hard distinction between the defense industry and the civilian industry, I think is becoming more and more blurred. And therefore, there is a need to think very strategically about the interactions between civilian technological development, how they can feed into military technological development, how those military technological development will impact doctrine and strategic thinking, but also how we can secure the conditions of the civilian technological development, whether in terms of know-how, in terms of knowledge, in terms of production, intellectual production, but also, as you mentioned, in terms of access to raw materials. And basically, the idea is to say that there are now security implications to a lot of civilian developments that we are not used to think about, and that actors themselves are not comfortable thinking about, but that need to be thought of in interaction, much more than used to be the case.
So, thank you. I have the feeling that your answer was very clear, and here it's confirmed by the answer in the chat. And I received, because of a technological problem, my colleague could not ask in the chat directly. And the question concerned the French position toward the war in Ukraine. So we're going into more into the details, less about the concept. And in particular, if you could speak about this idea of or the French position towards the nuclear sharing in Europe.
Okay, so I have 9 minutes. I will try to summarize it in 9 minutes. I will begin by what I think is an evolution of the current government's approach to Russia, which is very obvious. When Macron came to power in 2017, he did not have a lot of international experience. And so his international mindset was basically formed around, baseline mainstream ideas on France should be this different voice within NATO. We should try to engage with Russia. And this kind of baseline mainstream French exceptionalism that you can find sometimes in, still now in, let's call it public commentariat in Paris. And that is what triggered the first steps of, inviting Putin to, I think it was in 2018, to a summit, starting to talking about we should not humiliate Russia, this kind of stuff. After the aggression in 2022, I think Macron was had invested a lot of political capital in trying to build a personal relationship with Putin, and he felt played by Putin himself. That's a first reason. The second reason for a change in attitude, I will say, is that there has been an observable and obvious uptick of hostile Russian activities against France, whether in terms of propaganda activities, whether in terms of sabotage, whether in terms of subversion. And all this is being picked up by the security services. And like seeing the hard evidence that, you know, like Russia is conducting hostile activities, that has also shaped how Macron is thinking about it. And the third motivation is that Macron is a firm believer in, let's call it European strategic autonomy, for lack of better words. We can get into it afterwards. I doubt we'll have the time, but he's a firm believer in European strategic autonomy. And he realized that his position and attitude towards Russia was undermining Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe, which are required partners to build and contribute to his vision of reinforcing Europe, because he firmly believes that there is a risk that Europe will be caught between a rock and a hard place if the US turns at best indifferent, at worst hostile. And if it is caught between a hostile China and a hostile Russia, with a United States, which is at best indifferent, at worst hostile, there needs to be a European response to that. And he realized that his attitude was undermining his ultimate long-term plan of building something. So the three factors together, losing trust in Putin, seeing hostile Russian activities, and the need to build his European objective, that explains this change in attitude towards Russia. So I think that was the first part of the question. The second part on nuclear sharing. So here it is when it becomes difficult for because the nuclear sharing that France could have in mind is very different from the US/NATO nuclear sharing. And it boils down to a difference in doctrine. The US say that they are doing what we call extended deterrence. So basically, they extend their nuclear deterrence to NATO allies, and the integrity of the NATO alliance is supposed to be as important as the integrity of the US territory. And to make sure that it is credible, the US has given or allowed the stocking of nuclear weapons, American nuclear weapons, on allied territories in Belgium, Germany, Turkey. There are others, but I forgot. Because it's meant to symbolize and credibilize the nuclear extended deterrence. France never believed in US extended deterrence. This is why Paris developed their own autonomous nuclear deterrence capability, because they always mention, we don't think that the US are going to be willing to sacrifice New York in order to defend Hamburg or Warsaw or Berlin. We don't believe that. Therefore, we need to have our own nuclear deterrence. But this is where it becomes tricky. The French nuclear doctrine is based on the notion of vital interests. We are supposed to only use nuclear weapons in case of threats against French vital interests. Those vital interests are never clearly defined, for a reason, which is that if you define them, you basically give the green light to an aggressor to do everything they want below the threshold. Therefore, we don't want to give a threshold so that the adversary keeps guessing as to, okay, am I clear to it or not? And if they are guessing, maybe they don't want to risk it. But of course, already since the 70s, we realized that the vital interests cannot be limited to the French national territory because, you know, if, let's say, the Soviets, now the Russians, invade all of Europe and they stop at the French border, well, you know, no NATO, no EU, you can be defeated even if you are not invaded. So we don't want to be defeated either. Therefore, since the 70s, French presidents have regularly signaled that French vital interests are very likely to be extended to the territorial integrity of European member states. And this is what Macron is reaffirming at the moment, basically saying we need to talk about nuclear deterrence because it's in our French vital interests to also maintain the security of European member states. But he's not, at least yet, suggesting that the French doctrine is officially going to move towards an extended deterrence the way the US is doing it. And there's also a reason for that, is that a second pillar of the French doctrine is a principle called strict sufficiency. So we don't have more nuclear weapons than what we think is required to deter a potential aggressor. If we were moving to an extended deterrence framework, we should build more nuclear weapons in order to share them with our allies. And we just don't have the financial capability to do it at the moment. So what Macron is suggesting is to have actually a much more, let's say, sustained discussion among Europeans about the borders of the extension of the French vital interests, because nowadays it has only been like a French expression of saying, you know, we are not covering Europe, but Europe is part of our vital interest. But there is an argument to be made that if it was becoming a more European discussions, it will, you know, give further credibility when the French are saying it, basically. And this is what Macron is suggesting, to actually have state-level discussions about the boundaries of the vital interests within a European framework. But he's not suggesting to do extended deterrence the way the US is doing it, and to do nuclear sharing the way the US is doing it, because we just don't have the financial capabilities to do it, and to like build up our nuclear arsenal to share it with other allies. I hope it was clear enough.
Thank you. It was incredible to answer to so complicated questions on a such clear way. And so quickly, the last question was answered, as you said, in 8 minutes. 8 minutes to describe, I don't know if we can call it the new doctrine or the new attitude of France toward or facing the actual situation. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, our time is ending for this conversation. Maybe you would accept one day or another to come back to us in the future. We enjoyed a lot your presentation, your discussion. We appreciate a lot that you found time to see us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And if there is any further question or clarification, don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm especially mentioning the students. I understand that there are students in the audience. If there are any other question, I'm happy to at least try to answer it.
We have students and some colleagues. Yes. Thank you again. And to the public and to all of you, see you in 2 weeks for our next meeting. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.